Kia ora he uri tēnei o Te Atiawa me Taranaki, ko Alice Tukuna Saumaleulua. I teach at the Faculty of Māori and Indigenous Studies at the University of Waikato, and one of the great joys of the last 3 years of my life has been a Marsden funded project called Writing the New World, Indigenous Texts 1900 to 1975. The project spends time going all around the region, 1900 to 1975, a period that we actually don't know that much about. We spend a lot of time talking about kind of first adventures and connections with Europeans coming into the region, and we talk about more recent things, but particularly in the area of writing and literary studies, which is my own background, it's kind of like what really happened between the end of the kind of contact colonial period and Albert Wendt, like what happened in that time in between. Writing the New World has brought together 16 different Indigenous researchers from all around the region with really different backgrounds and different perspectives and different skills. And the podcast is intended to feature their views, their ideas, their experiences, so that you also can have an opportunity to connect with this writing, but also with the region that it comes from. The whole concept of the podcast is so much that happens at universities, really are things that people beyond the university might be interested in hearing about. We're interested in celebrating the writing from this time period, but also celebrating the work of the amazing researchers that have worked on the project. And so we are hopeful that members of their communities and the members of the communities that produce this writing in the first place would find these podcasts to be interesting, and maybe would have them ask some questions and feel interested in knowing a bit more about the writing of their own communities. In order to contribute to the New Zealand Pacific and Māori Language Weeks, in 2020 a special issue of the podcast is being launched with each of those language weeks, featuring people from those language communities speaking about their research in that language.
Tēnā koutou, kia ora, talofa. I'm your podcast host, Wanda Yomir Allen. Today's podcast features some brilliant Indigenous young minds, undergraduate researchers whose journeys into the archives in search of the writing of their own people have been both personally and professionally rewarding. The initial tentative steps grew more confidently as they drew inspiration from the authors they were finding and getting acquainted with. Enjoy their kōrero.
Talofa lava o lo'o ingoa o Saumaleulua Gardenia Laoiang. O le noa o te Saumei ai o Whasito o Tai ma Leo Suali'i, o Polo Samoa, ai o te whanau mai I Hamilton, New Zealand. So talofa lava, my name is Saumaleulua Gardenia Laoiang. I go by Sal.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Areta and Siutu tōku ingoa. Hei ri tēnei no te maunga o Panekire me te moana o Waikare. Nā reira, he whakapapa tōku, he whakapapa oku ki Ngāti Ruapani me Ngai Tūhoi ki Waikare moana. So kia ora, my name is Areta and Siutu, and I hail from the beautiful Te Reweras. There is a beautiful lake there called Waikare moana, and my people come from the south shore of that lake, where our iwi, our tribes are Ngāti Ruapani and Ngai Tūhoi.
Talofa lava lo ingoa Siutu o nese motoa, los follow up tausanga, o unuu o Sātaua I koa, moataa ma asau. Ai o auna whāngau I ngai New Zealand, kirikiri roa. So yeah, talofa lava, my name is Siutu o nese motoa.
The origins of my name comes from my dad's side of the family. I was named after my auntie, who I think was named after her grandma, and then it's been passed on down through majority the females. The meaning of my name when translated into English, is literally come with the necklace. So, sounds a bit weird to name someone with that name, but my understanding of it is when you look at the meaning of the necklace or the ula in Samoan culture, it's about celebration of new life, special occasions in terms of weddings and birthdays. So, it's kind of a depth of we are celebrating something. So for me, that's what my name means. I tend to go by Sau, only to protect it. That's my thing at the moment. In Western society, it's mispronounced a lot. And so I'm not too keen to kind of have people who are unfamiliar with our Samoan language to try and pronounce it.
My ingoa, my first name Areta, it hails from my mother's father's mother, so my great-grandmother, my kuia, Ani Areta. So I was named after her to carry her whakapapa. And the name Ranginui is actually the first name of my koko's grandfather. So he gifted his first name to his 3 children, and so their last names were Puke Puke, but he gifted them Ranginui as their last name. So our whānau name Ranginui is carried only by 3 generations of people. 4 generations. Yeah, including myself. Yeah. My whānau whakapapa hails from the beautiful Te Urawera, where there is a gorgeous lake, or I call it a vast ocean almost, called Waikaremoana, and my whakapapa is along the south end of that lake there, to Tūhoi and Ruapani. So I was brought up here in Waikato, and my whānau tried to go back home as much as we can, but yes, at the moment this is where we call home. And kia ora.
My name Siutu comes from my mum's side of the family, so my grandma, and I'm not really sure if it is a Samoan name because from family stories, the name was brought over by my great-grandparents from my mum's side from Papua New Guinea because they were missionaries for the Samoan Methodist Church, so they travelled over there, and so we have some of our ainga which stayed behind in Papua New Guinea and didn't return to Samoa. Onesemo is my grandpa's name from my dad's side, and also my dad's first name, so it's kind of so that I may be able to have a piece of them, like if I do move on to marriage, I'm changing my last name so that I may still have that connection to my dad's side of the family. And
okay. So in 2018, I joined the Writing the New World gang, and so I was my role was that I was to look at the periodicals within the Pacific Islands Monthly magazine, where it was from 1900s to 1975. So my objective was to gather data on all the Pacifica writers that were in there. So at that time, that was quite daunting because it was such a, it was a world that I had never really entered into in terms of looking at our own people doing their own, having actual published works out there. So what I found is so the Mana magazine, that's the birthplace of the Mana magazine, which had started in March 1973, and that's where the editor was Marjorie Crocombe. She had started it off for us, and so what I found interesting was that we actually had quite really accomplished Pacifica writers and artists in there, it was such a small space within that magazine given to them, but wow, they really put out some really beautiful pieces of work. So what I was doing was just pretty much gathering their names, where they were from if I could find it, some of the work in there, whether it's short stories, poems, or even art, pieces of art, they had come with no names. And it kind of speaks to a lot of like our culture of Pacifica, where we're quite humble, and so some of them had sent them in anonymous, but they're beautiful work. So that's one interesting finding. And I think too, for me, there was a lot of, because of the time period that it was, there was a lot of work where a lot of it was about activism, and trying to really push out there the issues that were going on for the Pacific region in the Pacific, and also within New Zealand and Australia. The Pacific Island Monthlies was initially a magazine for the territories and the the little colonies within the Pacific, and that was their way of kind of communicating with each other and keeping up to date with what was going on within Britain, Australia, and New Zealand in particular. So to have those pieces in there was really cool. It was just, for me, I wasn't born until 1988, so just seeing stuff that was out there before I had come into the world was beautiful. So that was what I did from November 2018 to I think February 2019. Yes, I think so.
So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. So the Mana magazine came out of the Pacific Island Monthly, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So did you find writers who were writing in both at the same time?
In particular the kind of the big hitters that we know of. So Marjorie Crocombe was one, Albert Wentz, I'm trying to think, Kornai,
Hello Thaman.
Hello Thaman. So you can see there was those writers and poets and artists that had quite already a big impact within that scene, were entering into different pathways of getting their voices out there and the way that they view the world as Pacifica. So Epeli Haufa is one. Yeah, definitely. So seeing that, I mean, I weren't introduced to these people until I started university in 2016. And so it probably wasn't actually until 2017-18 when I really got to read their work in my major. So I had started off as Māori and Pacific Development as one of my majors, and I ended up graduating with Pacific and Indigenous Studies. So that's, through that pathway there is where I got to hear our own people away. And so that was cool. That was really cool because, being raised in New Zealand in a Western society, our schooling's quite focused on Western topics and issues and knowledge. So having that opened up to me really opened up my mind to the possibilities for us as Pacifica is not just limited to what we are often taught, to what our limitations are, but we can go beyond that. So definitely,
Inspirational. Areta, do you want to tell us about your kaupapa? What's your research objective in this project?
Yeah, so I was looking at published scholarly or non-fiction texts written by Māori in that same time period, before 1975. So I had a huge amount of work to look at, and so that was quite challenging for me, quite daunting, was the fact that I had such a big space to work in terms of, again, finding, tracking people's names, where they come from, other pieces that they've written and things like that. So it was such a vast field, I guess, to be looking into. So that was quite intimidating, and often I found as a undergrad researcher that it was really, I already said daunting, but yeah, it was just quite crippling almost to know that there's so much to look at, and so but yeah, it was still really awesome. I looked at I started off looking at the Journal of Polynesian Society, and seeing what Māori were being published in that journal specifically over from like the late 1800s through to the early 1950s. So I trawled through quite a lot of journals through there, just looking for Māori names, Māori history, Māori whakapapa. So it was quite eye-opening to know who was publishing, and also to know the histories and pūrākau that were being published, but without being from who actually had that knowledge. So, you know, quite often I would see history of iwi or history of prominent rangatira being put into these journals, but without reference to who shared this history or who carried that history, who passed that on to the journal. So it was quite confronting to know that things like that happened, and you know, that's what we learn as we are Māori and Indigenous peoples, that quite often our histories were taken away from us, even though we were gifting it. So yeah, that was challenging, but still knowing that there were Māori publishing during that time, and that was really cool. And I also found that quite a lot of what has been written in the last, 30, 50 years is what has been written for a little while as well by our academics, I find. Things that I've been reading from the last 10 years that I read within my studies are like, oh yeah, that's Mina's idea, yep, cool, tautoko. That was written, in the earlier years as well. People were talking about the same things. So yeah, that was quite a cool part, I think, for me.
Can I ask you about the sense of feeling a bit overwhelmed?
So it was a bit of both, I guess, like not knowing where to start, because I could look anywhere, because I know that there is Māori publishers, Māori writers everywhere where you look. So to look for non-fiction or scholarly pieces, it was just not knowing where to begin, and knowing that I could pick a line of whakapapa to follow in terms of someone's writing, and it would just branch off to so many other places. So trying to pick one and follow one, and then getting carried down another path. So it was challenging in terms of trying to I think I realised that I wasn't going to be able to master finding every single thing by one writer, or finding specific things that I wanted to find. It was just having to find what I found. Do you know what I mean? Or in terms, not even finding it really, just following what the text and what following the writers, their whakapapa and the whakapapa of the text that I was reading. So yeah, it was. That was the part that was challenging, was knowing that I wasn't going to be able to not do it justice, but knowing that there's still so much more out there that I perhaps didn't get to have a read or put in my database to be, looked at. So that was more.
Yeah. And I guess for us, and it's just something to put out there if you guys want to respond to, is that sense of wanting to do right by our people, but knowing there's so much work to be done.
Yeah.
But also understanding, especially when you're new into the research, that it's all right to just do one little part.
Yeah.
Did you in the end get to appreciate what that meant?
Yeah, I definitely learnt that after a little bit of flailing around as an unexperienced researcher, trying to work out, how do I do this all? And then I realising that I'm not supposed to do it all. But I went through little phases of, okay, I know this is a huge field, but I want to find people from my home, where I'm from. Okay, let's have a look who was publishing, who was putting out texts, or what about some wahine, some women who were publishing, where could I go there, or why don't I focus on this paper series and see who was, finding little spots that I thought were interesting to me, or something that I found that I would like to look at in a smaller little segment of, all those whakapapa links. There was just a little link here that I would be looking at. But it took me a little while to realise that, and because trying to know, it's such a huge project, and knowing that, I could be looking at all of this. How's this little thing going to contribute to this big thing? So just about looking at knowing that it's all right to just look at these smaller parts and take it as it is, because it's all important and it all should be honoured. So
talk about and that's why it was really good to talk about your names, because your name is just, you inherit all this, pretty much like the work that we do. We do one little piece, and we often hear people say, particularly Alice, you don't have to do all the jobs. Like, you just do what you can, and that is vital to the whole link. Someone else will come and do the next part, but at least they've got a little platform to jump off, eh?
There's this, I read something a few maybe last year, I think, in one of my papers for reading, and it just explained the beauty of, or like the notion of understanding and seeking knowledge as an Indigenous person is, it's not about mastery of a knowledge, it's about humbling yourself to know that the more you know, the less you understand about things, and you have to be in a humbled position of when you're seeking knowledge. It's not about seeking and mastering and conquering the knowledges, it's about having a position of humility and understanding. So that's what I can think of when I think of that.
Absolutely. Areta was talking about the sense of feeling overwhelmed and as she said, a bit crippled about not only the sheer volume of what to do, but not knowing how to start. And so Areta was really gracious in telling us, and very generous in telling us how she overcame that by identifying the small parts that she could contribute to. Areta. And so so that kind of sense of we're part of the chain. We don't have to do all the jobs. Just going to do it for Mila to come around in another 20 years to pick up his mum's work. Cool. All right, so Siutu, do you want to tell us about your research project?
So, I was privileged to be on Alice's team for both years. So when Sal was on the team, and then when Areta was as well, for which ended at the beginning of last year. But for this conversation, I'll talk about the most recent research I undertook, which was looking at Pacific and Indigenous writing produced by or within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, so also the Mormon Church as it's known. And it was kind of hard because I didn't know how narrow I had to put my scope, whether it was anyone who was had a connection to the church, or whether it was officially published by the church. And so I just firstly I found a periodical called tikanga, which roughly translate to the messenger. So it was a magazine which was, it started in 1907, so early 1900s, and it was, the purpose was for communication between the missionaries and tangata whenua, as well as the rest of Aotearoa. So it was just a way to get information to and from around the world as well. So there were the advertisements for random things that they were selling, but then there were also people writing about spiritual matters, about God and Jesus Christ, and but so it was kind of a different experience to what Sal and Areta had, because I was kind of excited, I wonder what activism went on, but I guess it's because the nature of the magazine, religious, I guess it wasn't the place for those type of like texts to or like pieces to be published. So I wasn't able to find much like poetry or like like creative writing. It was more so like these spiritual experiences, which was still like really important as well. One of the really cool things I found was I might get the dates wrong, but it was written in I think 1930s by a Māori writer, Stuart Meha, and he's like quite well known in the church because he's done a lot of work, especially in regard to the translation of the Book of Mormon into Te Reo Māori. And so there was a piece he wrote, and it was just basically talking about how there was kind of already knowledge within tangata whenua that the church was going to arrive in New Zealand by certain like elders in different in different iwi. They had some like visions that a church was coming in. The way they identified it was people who prayed with their arms raised to the square, so that people pray with their arms like this, which no longer happens in the church. But when the church first arrived, they did pray like that, the missionaries, and that's how the people knew, okay, this is the church that was set to come to Aotearoa, which I thought was really cool because it felt really close to stories we hear like within my own family, like there's lots to do with spiritual the spiritual nature of things, like having visions or having dreams, and often it's like prophecies that will like come to pass. And so I found that really interesting. Something really hard was that the really early publications were in Te Reo, so I didn't want to to try and give or find like a translation, because I know it will never capture everything that is actually being written, and it may be like offensive in some sense if I were to try find a easily translated version so that I could understand it. So that was a difficulty for me, but I think it's something cool for whoever will pick up the project next and has that understanding to be able to understand what they were writing about. Because but it's just the same as Areta and Siutu. It was nice to see we've had like our people writing a long time ago, and it like really pushes back on that colonial narrative that Pacific and Indigenous writing only started post 1975, and so I thought that was really cool. And so it was mainly focused on like spiritual things, but then there are also times where I guess it was when there would be. It was really about just getting understanding of one another's cultures and their beliefs. So there were some parts where it would travel around in different countries, especially around the Pacific. Like it would be like our friends in Samoa, and then they'll be having some people from Samoa writing, and then it would just give like little background. So it would be like, here's a recipe from Aotearoa, but for what I found with the one in regards to New Zealand was it felt quite colonial, like it was written by a non-Pacific or Indigenous person, but when it got to the Pacific Islands, it was written by Pacific people, which I found was cool. So
what are the lessons that you've learned in this project in the text of Indigenous writers that you can take, and what are the skills that you can take for the rest of your studies?
I think for me, probably the biggest lesson learned from when I did the project was that the challenges aren't new. They have been passed on throughout the generations. So, how many years later, I'm 31 now, and it's a learning curve. It's still learning, still trying to find my way in the world, and then trying to figure out where I stand within the research. So at the moment it's just I think for me I'm really starting to realise the importance of having to look back to inform the way forward for me. It's really looking at what was done before and what were the challenges that they went through and accomplishments that had come out of the challenges that they overcame. How can I learn from them, from that, to help me with my current studies? So Yeah, so and it even goes beyond this, beyond my life as a, you know, as a postgrad. It's also looking at how it applies personally within how I raised my family, in particular my children, and also how I work, because I work for a Pacific organisation. You know, it really helps me to be not critical but possibly more aware of my surroundings and what we actually, how people perceive us within, you know, this dominated, Western dominated setting. So yeah, I think that's the biggest positive, was just seeing, you know, that the challenges that we are facing aren't new, and we've had some of our, you know, or actually all of our people and our ancestors go through it, just in different time settings, but things seem to be kind of continuing on. So how can we, moving forward as the next generation, actually push the boundaries even more, to add it upon the stories that have, you know, and the lives that have already done so. So yeah, that's my biggest thing. I really, there was one poem in there called Me the Labourer by Saumaleulua. Yeah, and that one is awesome, because it just, you know, and he speaks about working as a labourer, working to make the road as a road worker, but then having his work not appreciated by the people that are using it, and, you know, having the Balangi man drive on the road and ignore him. But yeah, it was his hard work and his sweat and his, you know, his blood that had contributed to what has made life easier for people. So it's things like that that I really, you know, I have in the back of my mind, and when I'm doing my studies and when I'm working in the role, because I work in the family violence sector, and then also when I'm with my children and raising my kids and trying to help them navigate the two worlds that they're living in, you know, being born as a New Zealand born, but also a Pacific Island child or Samoan child. So things like that, yeah, I think is really awesome. I think that's pretty much what the biggest learning that I've gained. Yeah.
What about you two? What are your thoughts on that? Or on your own learnings?
I guess, well, similar, you know, it's important to look back, always be looking back and remembering and honouring those who have come before us, because, yeah, our struggle has not just been our struggle in this present moment that we've been alive, it's been the generations and generations who've been fighting. And so it's beautiful to know that sometimes when we feel alone, you know, when we're just living life every day, knowing that, you know, our tipuna, our ancestors, were the ones who were fighting the same fights as us, and knowing that it's in our blood to challenge and continue on. But I guess one of the biggest learnings I got from reading all this academic non-fiction work is that, you know, as you can kind of, whatever you're doing in your own kind of lane, in your avenue, in your field, whatever you do, you're still honouring your ancestors and you're honouring your future generations through your work. You don't have to do everything. Like, I know as Indigenous people, and I think especially Māori and Pacifica, we're expected to be, you know, well-rounded. Our knowledge is not just related to academics, it's related to tikanga and practices and languages and family responsibilities and responsibilities to the land, and all these, there's so much to our lives. And what I got to see in, I guess, in the writings was that, you know, they were often writing, and some of the writers would write about the histories and the whakapapa and the stories of their iwi. Others were writing about, you know, anthropology related things and looking at, or others were linguists and looking at languages, and they would stick to their avenue and their field. And so it was like, for me, knowing that even though what I'm doing may not be well-rounded, and I just I guess it just makes me feel safe to know I don't have to be an expert in all areas to be able to contribute. Is that I can stick to my area that I want to contribute, as well as still be learning in other areas, but knowing that I don't have to be an expert at everything to be able to still contribute and be honouring those voices and things like that. I guess that's one of the biggest learnings that I've taken from it.
And the biggest learnings for me, or from this last research project, was that how people were writing in all areas. So they didn't have to wait for a space to open up for them to produce writing. They were producing writing in religious public periodicals, just in general ones as well. And so I guess that encourages me to it's don't wait for an opportunity. We have to create it ourselves, just as they have for us. And then I guess just one issue we stumble across is access and awareness. How do we get the next generation or the upcoming to realise that there is a whole ocean of Pacific and Indigenous writing out there, and it's just there's certain circles we have to get around to be able to access those writings. And that's a challenge, but it's also a blessing to be able to be involved in this work to help open up those spaces or make them more visible.
Yeah, very important message. So you keep moving. Move a little bit.
I'm getting nervous.
This is why we're doing a couple of t-shirts.
Okay. Where's the
Sorry.
Welcome back, Soul.
I'm almost dying. Man, I was trying my best to hold it, and I was like, don't cough that. Oh, no, I can't. Oh, sorry. You're doing awesome.
I was trying to figure out where I was going to go next, and I'm just like, oh no.
Cool.
Nice and loud, okay?
Okay.